Hello, I'm Pastor Nanette Christofferson, and along with Pastor Steve Talmadge, we offer these short Bible studies on our lectionary readings. This week, we are back in the season. Well, we started the season of Pentecost with Pentecost 1, then we had Holy Trinity Sunday, and now we are entering into week 2 of Pentecost. And as we enter into this new season, we find ourselves back in the Gospel of Mark, which was where we were in the change of seasons in Advent and throughout Epiphany as well. We will now be in this Gospel of Mark for the next 26 weeks. Actually, there's a short break with the Gospel of John as we go through 5 weeks of I am the bread of life. But let's concentrate today on our reading, which is Mark 2, 23 to Mark chapter 3, verse 6. And let's start with a little background information. Many of us know that Mark is considered to be the first of the 4 Gospel canticles. And it's important to determine whether the gospel was put into written form before or after Rome destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. But this event is a landmark, and it's difficult to determine exactly at the time when Mark's composition took place. While the author of this gospel remains unknown, most of the tradition would associate the book with a disciple named John Mark. And this disciple was one who knew Peter and also traveled with Paul. Whoever the author may have been, the purpose of the gospel writing is to focus attention solely on Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God. Just to notice a few things in Mark's gospel here. I know I've mentioned this before, and I'm sure Pastor Steve has as well, that the disciples in Mark's gospel are often picked as not understanding, as maybe a little slow to understand or a little dense. Jesus teaches about discipleship in the context of references to his death and resurrection. And 3 times Jesus does this, and 3 times they don't understand it. And 3 times Jesus is diverted into helping the disciples understand by teaching them the way of discipleship. In this gospel, we hear Jesus referred to as the Son of God. The demons and the unclean spirits know Jesus as the Son of God. The only time in Mark that human lips confess Jesus as the Son of God is in the moment following the tearing of the curtain in the temple. The evangelist has drawn us to the cross throughout the gospel, where we too are called, in light of the cross, to make our confession as Jesus as the Son of God. There's other different titles in this gospel too. Jesus is called Son of Man. He's the only one, though, who uses this expression, and he uses it to identify himself. And he uses it in three different contexts. One, to assert his authority on earth to be able to forgive sins and his status as Lord of the Sabbath. To explain his suffering, rejection, crucifixion, and resurrection. And also to describe his vindication when he will return and reign as Lord, seated at the right hand of God, coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Son of the Most High, he was also referred to as this, but this didn't come from a human, or it came from a demon-possessed man who confessed him to be the Son of the Most High God. And we might remember this man as the one who lived among the tombs and encounters Jesus. In this gospel, we'll see that there's also no distinction between Jew and Greek. Mark points out the universal character of Jesus' mission, and he points this out in the first 3 chapters, where he sets up a contrast between John the Baptist, who preaches to the people from Judea and Jerusalem, and Jesus, who preaches and heals people from everywhere, including Idumea, beyond the Jordan, and the region around Tyre and Sidon, and all Judean lands. Jesus and his disciples continually cross over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, visiting the land of the Gerasenes and the Greek cities of Decapolis. He even interacts with pig herders. The emphasis on the inclusion of Greek-speaking people continues with the healing of the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman and of the deaf man in Decapolis. Mark draws the theme of inclusion to a close by placing the confession, "Truly, this man was the Son of God," and this was said from the lips of the Roman centurion. So let's take a look at the big picture. According to the Gospels, Jesus was involved in 16 healing miracles, whereby God, through Jesus and the power of faith, healed a person. The Gospel of Mark records 10 consecutive incidents at the beginning of his gospel, where Jesus was involved with people being healed of their diseases. These healings were signs that the reign of God was present. So let's take a look at our reading. So it begins with one Sabbath, and it just kind of shows that the story is a continuation of the previous story. And it says Jesus was going through the grain fields, he and his disciples, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" On the Sabbath, the disciples were picking grain and rubbing the grain with their hands. The Pharisees declared that such actions were considered work and the violation of God's law not to work on the Sabbath. This is a wonderful illustration of how degenerated a good religion can become. You see, for the Pharisees, their religion had deteriorated into rules, regulations, and rituals. Rulers, regulations, and rituals became more important than mercy and kindness, more important than serving other human beings in need. Jesus is trying to demonstrate the spirit of the Sabbath, so he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Of course, Jesus, as always, is brilliant in his insights into the Old Testament and the way he uses the Old Testament to show his point of view. Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." This statement is grounds for blasphemy. The Pharisees are shocked at this, and in this passage, Jesus is not accused of blasphemy, but he clearly indicates that the Son of Man himself is the Lord of the Sabbath. Only God was the Lord of the Sabbath. Notice that again, Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and as he does so, Jesus is referring to himself. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. The previous story has set the stage for Jesus' healing on the Sabbath, which was against the Pharisees' petty interpretation of the laws of the Torah. The past two incidents have laid the groundwork for this story of the man with the withered hand being healed on the Sabbath. I can just see the Pharisees kind of waiting to see what he's going to do. They want to catch him, right? Or at least be able to see what he's up to so they can start plotting against him. Throughout the Gospels, there is a consistent theme that the Pharisees and religious leaders were plotting against Jesus and trying to find some legitimate accusation against Jesus for disobeying their strict interpretations of the Jewish law. We smile inwardly as we see the cleverness and intellectual craftiness of Jesus, who circumvents their arguments by using the logic of their own Jewish Torah. Jesus demonstrates the truth about God. And then Jesus said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." And then Jesus said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" Of course, Jesus asks the best questions, doesn't he? Jesus stunned those Pharisees with his impeccable logic. Jesus used their own scriptures against the hardness of their hearts and minds. And they were silent. Jesus stopped those Pharisees in their tracks, and they had nothing to say. He looked around them with anger. He was grieved at the hardness of heart. This is the only time in the scripture that the gospel tells us that Jesus had anger. It takes a lot to get Jesus mad, and petty arguments of the Pharisees pressed his hot button. Notice that Matthew and Luke omit Jesus' reference to being angry, as if his being angry would be too human. We recall Jesus cleansing the temple and driving out the money changers, but the word anger is not used in the story, although Jesus was using a whip and appeared angry at the desecration of the temple. Hardness of heart. Interesting phrase, isn't it? How we can all have a hardness of heart in our righteousness. In the Message, Eugene Peterson writes it this way: Jesus looked them in the eye, one after another, angry now, furious at their hard-nosed religion. Jesus heals, but it leads to the unfolding drama, and it continues. And Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, was in power in this province of Galilee, and it assured that the Herodians were people of the ruling class, and it assumed that the Herodians were people of the ruling class who were associated with the reigning governor of Galilee. Thus begins the plot for the Pharisees to plan for the execution of Jesus. The seed was planted at this moment for the unfolding drama and events that led up to Good Friday and Jesus' death on the cross, all carefully orchestrated by the Pharisees. So let's take a look at a couple of questions. The lectionary writers have connected the Old Testament readings to our gospel reading. When watching the previous overview, we discussed the heart of the commandment. To remember that in creation, God rested after 6 days, the heart of the commandment to keep the Sabbath holy. And it goes all the way back to Genesis, but it also goes back to Exodus. And that this commandment is there to remember God brought them out of slavery. In the New Testament, how are the Pharisees interpreting the commandment? And they have really just added law upon law about what you can and can't do. So they've kind of lost the spirit of the reasons why they rest. They rest because God has given them this day, and they rest because God brought them out of slavery. Besides attending weekly worship, so let's kind of think about our world today. How do you take time for Sabbath? And why is weekly worship important to you? I love that question because when I ask people that question, you get so many different answers. Worship, of course, is really important to me because I feel like it cleanses my soul. It gets me in the right steps for the week, and I miss it when I don't have it. And it helps me realize that God is God and God comes first. But there's other ways to take Sabbath during the week or other days to rest as well. And in each day, we can take time out to rest, to worship, to pray, to do devotionals, and have a time of Sabbath from the world as well. All of that is very important spiritually and also as ways of connecting to God. And it's easy for us to put the Sabbath aside and forget about it. And so it's very important. Sabbath is, of course, important to me, the weekly worship, but also I know it's important to all of you who end up in our sanctuary, all of you who watch online, how important the Sabbath is in taking time to rest, time to pray, time to think about God and not ourselves, right? So I hope this week you have some time to think about your moments of Sabbath. Blessings on your journey.